Jonathan Hall, KC, is the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation since 2019?
Since 2019,
In 2019, I do apologise. Jonathan Hall joins us now. A very, very good afternoon to you.
And to you.
Let's talk about, first of all, the 20th anniversary of 7/7, the extraordinary attack on tubes and buses in central London 20 years ago today. Absolutely devastating impact. 52 people died, more than 800 injured, many with life-changing injuries. We've got a memorial service going on right now in St Paul's Cathedral, attended by the great and the good, and we should always remember those who lost their lives in the incredible heroism at the time. But in terms of focusing on, well, preventing any future attacks, even we've had an awful lot since, although that is the deadliest on British soil. Have we got the right legislation in place to do that?
I think more or less, although we're struggling a bit with the internet. I mean, I think the internet it's not just a legislation challenge. It's how you deal with tech platforms that are willing to host really, really violent terrorist material that based elsewhere. It's not going to be solved by legislation. But broadly speaking, we have. I mean, I think the thing that people say is we've got this Terrorism Act. It's what they call threat neutral, which means it can adapt and deal with the changing sorts of terrorism. And broadly speaking, I think we have. But then something will come along like Islamic State, which no one had really predicted. And suddenly we had to look again at, how do you stop people travelling out to commit acts abroad? How do you stop them taking their children out? So I think broadly speaking, yes, but of course it's not perfect at all.
Well, listen, how big is the threat these days? Because we've had terror attack after terror attack. I mean, I remember 2017, that spate of terror attacks in June, Manchester Arena and others, London Bridge and Westminster. Very, very, very scary time. This is when just before the general election, when Theresa May was still in power. And it seems to be that the terror attacks sort of move on, and the legislation is constantly trying to catch up with the last crime that was committed. Are we constantly in a catch-up situation, and are we on top of the threat as it actually exists? Because we saw with Axel Rudikabana, the fact that he didn't fit into a particular category and to prevent. Was he Islamist? Was he having different sort of ideology? And somehow people slip through the net.
Yeah, look, I think you put your finger on something there. It's not. I mean, what Rudikabana did was not terrorism, but I'm afraid it's very inspiring to some people. And
there was a case only a week ago, wasn't there, of a young man
exactly.
following
and
suit.
I'm worried. Yeah, I'm worried that when the police go through the door and they find someone with some elaborate plot to carry out a school massacre or go and kill children in the nursery, what can they actually do there? If they're a terrorist, you can bang them up. They can be held and detained for up to life. But at the moment, there's a bit of a gap where you're not a terrorist. So I'm a bit worried about that. I think that's what everyone's really worrying about. It's the latest iteration. I mean, 2005, remember, that was the Al-Qaeda heyday, where you had these plots, maybe coordinated, having gone to a training camp, and they were going for some big spectacular. Then we had the whole ISIS phenomenon. Now it's very much lone actors, which are very difficult to detect and to stop.
And that's the real difficulty, isn't it? And we've seen again and again, though, when there have been lone actors who have been stopped, they've often been flagged to the authorities. Often, there've been concerns, but often we see that people go on to watch lists and then are, not removed from it, but we simply don't have the resources to, watch 40,000 people every single day, 24 hours a day. And yet it seems again and again, it is the people who are judged, could be a risk, not sure, don't have the resources, nothing's going on, we won't bother with this person. That's when we end up seeing a terror attack. Is this a failure of the legislation, the resources, the strategy, or is this just what we're supposed to just live with now?
I'm going to say something a bit bleak, but I think this is just what you have to live with. I mean, it's definitely a failure. Whenever a terrorist like Mohammed Sadiq Khan, so he's the man who led the 7/7 plot. I mean, that was a failure because he was known about by the authorities and he was under surveillance on the edges of a different plot. But I mean, I don't know if this is just a contradiction in terms, but it was a reasonable failure because the resources just aren't there to follow everyone. We wouldn't necessarily want to have spies on every corner. So it's a horrible thing to say, but it's impossible to stop everything, and we will. And
it is, and we understand at least 40 plots of sizable plots, not lone wolves, have been stopped by the authorities since 2005. So there are successes. We tend not to hear about them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you've got to add alongside that, which is another sort of worrying thing, a new bit on the mix. is the Iran-based attack plots. So these are assassination plots, effectively, where Iran is trying to recruit people to carry out murders. And I mean, a huge number. I think Ken McCullum, who's the Director General of MI5, talked about 20 plots disrupted since 2020. I mean, that's a large number of things that the security services are having to look at to throw into the mix.
Yeah, indeed. And again, the resources are absolutely huge. I mean, there's an interesting story today about terrorists inside British prisons teaching organised criminals how to make bombs. And in return for this, extremist inmates are learning from gang members how to launder money, how to use the dark web, how to obtain weapons that can be used in terror attacks. And we've seen a rise of Islamists being put behind bars, and they're often able to mix freely with should we say, ordinary criminals, non-ideological criminals, and we've seen attacks on prison officers in jail as well. You know, boiling oil and water, knife attacks. And there is a real concern that there is some stuff going on behind bars where surely we should think these people we're safe from them, but they're actually not only converting a lot of people to their cause, particularly vulnerable prisoners, but also that exchange of crucial information between organised criminal gangs and Islamist gangs.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, Julia, but I'm doing the report at the moment for the Lord Chancellor on what's to do about the separation centres. So this is after the Hashim Abedi attack. So, I mean, I can absolutely vouch that there's an internal dynamic that can increase the risk. And I mean, I looked at Dr. Hannah Bennett's PhD. I think what she was saying was not so much that there's lots of instances of that happening, but that it could happen. And this is an interesting phenomenon about the community as well. So for many years, people have talked about this crime-terror nexus. And I have to say, I don't really understand it myself. Why is it that the criminals who've got access to the firearms are not giving those to the terrorists so they can carry out the attacks? And if you think about France and Germany and Belgium, Russia, where firearms are much more freely available, terrorist attacks tend to be, I mean, we've suffered terribly.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, but even worse in places like France and Paris. Yeah. They've suffered enormously. Now, I can't explain why that hasn't happened.
Even in France. But I mean, we saw the Bataclan, they had weapons of Bataclan, but most of the attacks we've seen, even in mainland Europe, have been, you know, sort of again, with a car, with a lorry, crashing into people at a Christmas market, or someone with a huge big knife stabbing people, going on a rampage, not with a weapon that's hard to get hold of, like a semi-automatic rifle.
Well, I think those big attacks in 2015-16. I mean, of course you're right. There are attacks, the famous Nice attack with a lorry, but there have been significant number of firearms attacks and explosives attacks.
Right.
We haven't suffered from that so much in the UK, and I can't quite explain why that nexus hasn't operated in the community. I mean, Dr. Bennett is obviously right to say it could happen, but I also don't want to set hairs running and saying that you go into a prison and suddenly someone turns up and say, hey, do you want to know how to build an IED?
Yeah, that's interesting. But again, it may be a matter of luck that it hasn't happened. Should we need to tackle more of this issue? Can we talk about how the legislation is working? We had the vote in Parliament last week for Palestine Action to become a proscribed terrorist organisation, along with the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah and others. What difference does that make, other than we did see a demonstration at the weekend where people are holding up saying, they oppose genocide in Gaza and they support Palestine Action, and 29 people, they were lawyers and a university lecturer and others who were arrested for this because both membership and support for such an organisation is a crime. But does that change anything?
I think it does. I mean, if you think about what the government said, so they said that in each of the 45 police areas, there was a Palestine Action presence. And they have a website with a list of targets. And they had a manual which explained how to carry out covert activity. And they also offer training. Now, that's quite a big phenomenon to deal with, if you like, just using the ordinary criminal law. And I think what the authorities must have decided is we need to have these extra powers so that you can intervene a bit earlier. Otherwise, I mean, people make the argument, and it's a completely, reasonable argument to make. Look, deal with these people using normal criminal law. They carry out an attack on a plane, arrest them for criminal damage. But it's the fact that there's so much planning, and it's very difficult for the authorities to get ahead when you've got any number of, presumably thousands of targets that are some way connected to Israel or the defense industry, and it's impossible to stop that. So I think it's about what the authorities would call the tools that it gives. Then, of course, there's the question of, is it an unfair attack on protest? Is this going too far? I mean, look, my own view, and obviously I'm just a commentator on this and I review it, is that you've got to keep threat neutral. And quite a lot of people will say to me, surely this particular cause, you've got to give them some sort of exemption because of what's going on in Gaza. Surely you've got to recognise there's a paramount need to stop military jets and assistance to Israel. That's the cause. To which my response is, that may be the case, but people can obviously articulate their views, but they shouldn't use serious violence, damage to property.
No, because we have the vote. We have the vote here. What do you make of people likening organisations like this to the suffragettes? But of course, the suffragettes, 100 years ago, didn't have the vote.
No, I think that's right. I mean, the suffragettes, on the face of it, would fall within the definition of terrorism. So, I mean, I'm reviewing the law that we have. They, I think, probably went beyond Palestine action, you could say, because running in front of a jockey, the jockey could fall off and hurt themselves, and were putting people at risk. Yep. And the same is obviously true of Nelson Mandela. It's the biggest problem in terrorism studies is how to identify whether Nelson Mandela was a terrorist or not. And in almost all legal respects, he is. But that crucial point that you make is that there was no way of participating in a democracy to try and change minds. Which
is a very, very, very big difference. In terms of a lot of people raising issues, it's come up, we're discussing about criminality, when we're discussing benefits, cost to the country, taxes and all of that. But I think in relation to the terror threat, that's also an issue. How concerned are you, as someone who's spent so much time looking into this, as a Casey, that about the terror threat that is posed by having the mass illegal migration we've got on our borders, and so many of the people arriving are young men from war-torn areas where there is, for instance, a lot of Islamist extremism who are coming to this country. We often don't know who they are, where they're from. We know the security services have identified, they believe, there are certainly people coming across the channel through this method to get to this country. But how concerned are you about that threat to us on our safety?
It will increase the threat because the majority, say, of, just to take prescribed organisations, are Islamist, and they are based in or preoccupied about unstable parts of the world. And people tend to come into this country as economic migrants or as genuine refugees because they're coming from very unstable parts of the world. And so there's a correlation, isn't there, between the places that people tend to come from, like Afghanistan and the instance of terrorism. And I think it's a fair point to say that if you've been exposed, even as a victim, to terrorism, then that may make you a slightly more risky proposition when you arrive into the UK. So I think all of that is entirely accurate and fair. I mean, in my last annual report, I went to Manston, which is where they hold the people who've arrived on the small boats, and I made some critical comments about the fact that there wasn't an ability to screen everyone as quickly as they needed to. I mean, the authorities are obviously aware about this because I speak to them all the time, but it's definitely a factor, yeah.
Really interested to talk to you. Jonathan Hall, KC, thank you very much indeed. Always work as an independent review of terrorism legislation. We need people to do reforming this. Sam, looking at it. Sam Armstrong, what do you make of that?
Well, I thought his remarks on migration were very interesting, very straightforward. He says, look, the more of these people, especially from the most dangerous parts of the world, turn up on our shores, the greater the risks we're going to have, that we're going to face. And of course, the response to that is we all have to face clampdowns on our own liberties. And his job is to get that balance right, to help the government find that balance.
But I thought was what very telling. We said earlier about, it being quite bleak and just saying, like, well, no, this is how we live now. But it shouldn't have to be.
No.
We chose, well, our political leaders chose this for us, didn't they? By importing this problem. This wasn't a problem until some years ago, but there we are.